Who doesn't like a good old-fashioned zombie movie rooted in reality rather than supernatural parameters? Dawn of the Dead is one where if you take the 1970s version, these were supernatural beings that post-mortem arose with the affliction and began hunting down their previous companions or anyone in close proximity. In the 2004 version, this is more of an outbreak of a disease that attacks the brainstem as well as cerebrum of a person and activates various pathways to make them hungry and violent. So hungry, in fact, that they would attack family members and eat them. In today's episode, we will discuss what exactly happens in this version of the movie and what sort of virus are we dealing with. And I promise you, it's actually not rabies this time, so we can all breathe a collective sigh of relief on that front. But before breaking down this virus, we must first examine the timeline of events and ultimately how this would lead to an apocalyptic scenario which proved to almost be humanity's undoing. But first, I just want to give y'all a quick heads up. I am streaming more now that I have time to do so you can find all my old streams on Roanoke Games, which is my third channel because I'm super original. Or you could watch me over on Twitch at Roanoke Gaming YT, just so you guys know. All right, so back to it. So it starts in a hospital, naturally. As Anna finishes up her shift as a nurse, she heads home and ominous warnings begin appearing on the radio. But I don't really know about you guys, but after working shifts where you actually have to use your brain a lot, you typically run on complete autopilot on the way home. She heads home and gets caught up on date night and misses the emergency news bulletin as a result. Early the next morning and presumably through the night, a very quiet apocalypse had begun taking place. The neighborhood girl apparently had been changed and entered the room. Upon looking quite mutilated, Lewis freaks out and approaches her, requesting that Anna calls 911. However, this would prove to be his undoing as she bites him in the neck, severing his jugular vein, judging by the low flow pressure of blood. Anna attempts to call 911 while covering up the wound, but to no avail as the lines are completely tied up. In her attempt to get help, she disregards Lewis for a moment, where he eventually loses consciousness and then rises back up, completely taken over by the disease, and immediately begins to attack her. She bolts to the bathroom and shuts the door, where something interesting happens. Lewis stops attacking. This will be important for later on as it shows that perhaps object permanence has been lost, and lost quickly. And this may indicate what is happening in the human brain throughout the infection process. Anna decides to run and flees to her car with Lewis on the chase until someone else who is wandering around is attacked by him. And as she is escaping, looking at the absolute wreck her neighborhood has become, someone attempts to carjack her. She ends up stepping on the gas and fleeing him as well. However, in this process, she runs off the road and crashes into a tree, knocking herself unconscious. And here we get a pretty clear view of what is happening across the world. Riots and violence have overtaken order. As people run and try to escape the infested hordes, many drop in the process, adding to that number. Governments become overwhelmed and start having to take brutal measures to anyone who may attack. Essentially, the whole world begins to crumble as the infected begin to outweigh the non-infected. With Anna waking up, she is confronted by the group she will be with for the remainder of her time on the mainland. Police Sergeant Kenneth Hall, electronic salesman Michael, petty criminal Andre, and his wife Luda. After proving she is not infected, they break into a nearby mall and they find it has already had its fair share of infections. An infected mall cop attacks them. Luda is scratched and Kenneth is badly injured while wrestling with the infected until he is subdued by the boomstick. After they are confronted by CJ, Bart, and Terry, the other mall cops, Anna's group surrenders their gear in order to stay there. After, they split into groups to further secure them all and take out the infected mall cop, showing that destruction of the brain does indeed work against the infected. Upon getting on the roof, across the street they spot a man named Andy who operates the handheld store, and God, it is becoming so lame to say that, I really need to find a new way. So comment down below what sounds better. That won't totally wreck the prospect of these videos getting the green dollar sign, because I'm probably just gonna call it boomstick. Anyhow, he's across the road holding down the store, but the parking lot is completely infested with shambling masses. The next day, continuing to hold down the Fort Mall, a delivery truck of survivors rolls up. To CJ and Bart's dismay, they are disarmed and overruled as Anna's group accepts the survivors in. Norma, Steve, Tucker, Monica, Glenn, Frank, and his daughter Nicole, as well as a mysterious woman who nobody knew, was brought in. Although the mystery woman is pretty much on her deathbed, or really death wheelbarrow. As they move everyone in, the woman without a name takes her last breath and is pronounced DOA. Moments later, however, she sits up and begins to attack the group before Anna gets her through the eye with a poker. With this, Anna theorizes that the disease moves through bites. The smaller the bite, the longer it takes. And after this idea is realized, they discover that Frank has been bitten and quarantine him immediately. Upon doing so, his situation deteriorates rapidly and he begins to outwardly show signs of an immune response. Shortly after he succumbs, he is taken out by Kenneth upon his reanimation. As time progresses, Kenneth becomes absolute bros with Andy across the street and other people start hooking up. You know, party at the end of the world scenario. Eventually, as the power goes out, it becomes apparent that they will need to check the generator. They head down to the parking garage where the group is attacked. Bart is bitten and then eaten in the process, and the horde is doused in fuel and set ablaze. A dog is also found during this process, which would be used in the group's most dumb idea to date. During all this, however, Luda gives birth to Andre's baby, but takes her last breath during this process and then reanimates. They are found by Norma during this process, and after an exchange of rounds, all three are bodied. The zombified baby is found by Anna and then promptly executed. After this exchange, they realize they cannot indefinitely live at the mall. The group decides to make their way to the marina and travel on Steve's yacht to an island on Lake Michigan. They begin reinforcing the shuttles that they found in the garage, and on their way out, the plan was to pick up Andy. However, through this time, Andy's food rations have begun to dwindle, and he has approached starvation. To stave off this, they send the dog, who the infected appear to have no interest in, and attach food and a walkie-talkie. Chips is sent to Andy's store, but the infected ends up following the dog through the dog door. Nicole loses her mind and crashes a delivery truck into the store to retrieve her dog, as she is quite fond of it. As Kenneth is watching all this happen, he sees Andy is still on the roof. And there is also something interesting happening, because Andy appears to be writing something on the whiteboard, but then he just shows that he smeared it with blood. Despite being infected, old habits stay with him, which we will actually discuss. With the rescue underway for Nicole, the group would grab as much as they could and head back to the mall. However, Tucker would break his leg and CJ would attempt to drag him to safety. This would be fruitless, however, and CJ would mercifully take him out after Tucker was bitten by many different infected. Once reaching the mall door, Steve had not been guarding the door like he said he would, and due to his negligence, the mall would be breached and they would have no choice but to flee from it. Everyone enters the buses and begins navigating the wholly controlled by infected city. While trying to dispatch an infected clinging onto the bus, however, Glenn would lose control of the chainsaw and accidentally slice into Monica's torso, ending her in the process. He also ends up meeting his end when the bus crashes due to blood splattering on the windshield. Steve abandons Kenneth and Terry just seconds before he is ambushed as well and taken out by the same zombies clinging onto the bus. The others within the remaining bus pull over to pick up Kenneth and Terry before encountering the zombie Steve, who quickly fell to his bites. Anna takes him out and gets rid of the other zombies clinging onto the bus. Having dealt with Steve, Anna grabs his key to the marina and gets back onto the remaining bus to escape. The group then heads towards the marina, where CJ holds off the pursuing zombies after signaling to the others to escape. He soon finds himself overwhelmed and sacrifices himself to detonate the propane tank to take out the infected around him and those currently biting him. Ouchies. And in the end, Michael was bitten too and chooses to stay behind and let the group proceed without him. A lone shot rings out as the remaining group members head towards an island. There will be no rest, however. Footage from the camcorder on the boat concludes with a group of infected running out of the woods after they arrive on the island. The camcorder drops and the group's fate remains unknown. So now that you have basically seen the movie, if you've actually never seen it before, I would recommend going and watching it, but now you can kind of have a good idea that these are not supernatural beings or people who remain steadfast in the face of anything short of completely disassembling their bodies, but really they play more by the biological rules of our meat suits, and should enough damage be sustained, they will likely drop as any other person would. So what exactly is going on internally, and how are these people infected, and to what end, and what might they be infected with? Well, according to the health officials in the Dawn of the Dead movie, they don't know what's infecting them, they don't know if it's airborne, and they don't know if these people are alive or expired. Well, I am here to completely throw a wrench into that line of thinking because some assumptions can actually be made. First thing we need to establish in this is viral load and bite area. It would appear that bites closer to the brain of this person are actually faster acting. We see with Lewis, upon his neck being bitten, this would likely have pierced the carotid artery to some extent as well, which is the blood supply of the brain. Because the virus was introduced at such a critical point, it had a fast-acting effect on the brain. The virus quickly overwhelmed the body and turned Lewis in moments rather than minutes or hours. Later we see from a hand bite on Frank, he turned much more slowly, taking what seems to be hours. And even still with Luda, she was scratched, introducing a very small amount of viral particles to the body, meaning this took much longer in terms of days, if not weeks, for her to be fully infected. So what is viral load then? Viral load is as it sounds. How much of a given virus is there? Now, not with all, but with some diseases, there is a need for a certain amount of the virus present to actually cause infection. With other viruses, however, only one virus particle is needed to begin the infection. However, this can be sort of like likened to starting a fire with one match and large sticks versus starting a fire with a flamethrower and wood that is doused in gasoline. The less virus that makes it into the system, the longer it takes, and conversely, the more that makes it in, the quicker symptoms manifest. This is because the virus requires movement into the cells, the replication of itself, and the release of other viral particles. Pretty standard. So with this, we can conclude that the closer the bite is to the brain, and the more exchange of fluids between the infected and non-infected, the quicker the person is changed. And based on this, it must be a virus and not something like bacteria or a parasite or perhaps a prion disease. And yes, you can say prion as prion or prion. It appears to just be a matter of preference. Anyhow, bacteria may have a similar effect on the brain as does the virus, but it would not be able to replicate itself fast enough. Parasite would cause behavioral changes, but its ascent to the brain would be slow, which would require the passage of months to have any real effect. And prion disease can be relatively fast acting, taking months. However, it would not take just moments to cause the degradation that we see in the host. And I mean, just as a side note, the virus would have to be faster than any virus we have ever seen before. Likely not formed in nature, this virus from Dawn of the Dead would have definitely been man-made to achieve these effects. So establishing that it is in fact a virus, I would have to say based on the evidence given, this is not an airborne disease, but is more based in bodily fluids like HIV is. We do not see any of the infected coughing and actually see breathing difficulties not associated with coughing or sneezing. What we do see is perspiration to an extreme degree, the destruction of smaller blood vessels throughout the body, and salivating. This would indicate to me that this is actually a blood infection and is limited to actual bodily fluids. And here's why. Because the bursting of blood vessels and the presentation of gasping people towards their end. As the virus destroys blood vessels, this has a couple effects on the ability to transfer this disease. First, most infected are actually bleeding in their mouths. There are many blood vessels that run within this area, and with them bursting as shown in the other areas of the skin, this would allow the virus to go directly into the uninfected host's bloodstream. If they weren't bleeding, I would also be inclined to think that maybe there could even be some virus in their saliva. Considering the nature of the saliva and how many blood vessels run through the glands responsible for producing it, it's not too far-fetched to think that viral particles could be amassing here as well. And I mean, I just have to say, after all, we do see this with the rabies virus, but this is not to say that this is actually rabies. What I do believe it to be is an extreme case of viral meningitis. Viral meningitis is the most common type of meningitis and is not usually life-threatening, but again, judging by the speed at which the virus can take over the body, I believe it must do two things. First, it would need to obviously inspire an immune response. But second, I believe this response to be more allergic in nature, dependent upon viral load. A small amount introduced into the system allows for a natural response. Macrophages activated, they lose as the virus spreads through the body, replicating, eventually causing the meninges within the skull to expand and compress the brain. And this leads to symptoms that we see with people slowly changing. But if the viral load is large enough and close to the brain, an allergic response causes the internal surfaces within the body to begin swelling, as well as the blood vessels themselves. And as these surfaces swell, this may be what we see in the Mystery Woman. While heavier, it does appear as though if she is having some sort of swelling response, perhaps this may have been the allergic response rather than the meningitis response. This swelling would cause the blood vessels to also burst throughout because of the histamine response. And this is known as vasculitis. This is essentially when blood vessels inflame and burst. We see this actually in the eyes of the infected post-infection. Their eyes completely change, showing that they have become damaged. And because of this, the body recognizes the invader and completely freaks out if the virus is present in large amounts. Smaller amounts lead to a much more slow burn. Here, the body does have a response, but it is much more gradual, and because of this, the body does not swell as much. Blood vessels still burst and ultimately lead to the same end. The meninges swell, and this in turn puts pressure on the brain, which we can see actively happening in those infected. So let's take a look at that real quick and cite some examples. The first example I came across to show the brain is dealing with swelling is the actions of the infected. It is noted that short-term personality changes can become apparent during meningitis infection, and one of them is aggression. With the rapid pressure put on the brain, this can cause a person to fly into a rage-like state. However, as the pressure mounts within the brain, this can also put pressure on the brainstem. Which brings me to the point of people gasping. The brainstem actually regulates breathing. It's usually an unconscious thing, done without you having to think about it, but as I say this, I'm now manually breathing, and so are you. What fun we're having! With this pressure on the brainstem too, too much pressure can slow a person's breathing until finally it stops altogether. And after a person stops breathing, this is what appears to be the end of them. But is it really? We see that when a person stops breathing, moments later they're up and moving again. While the brainstem does control the heartbeat as well, the heart has secondary pacemakers in place to also keep it pumping. And that's why if you say like break your neck, you may still survive as your heart keeps beating. That said, what I believe is these infected are actually not bodied after they take their last breaths. The heart still pumps, but they go into a state of shock and their breathing stops. With them mentally checked out, so to speak, the most basic portions of their brain take over. This coupled with the virus meningitis gives them a severely altered form of instinctual drive to eat and aggression. This leads them to attack anyone and everyone around them, no matter who they are. And while on the topic of brains, however, I did want to point out something that's interesting. Not all higher thought is lost, although with Lewis, he did lose his ability to understand understand object permanence, which does indicate some damage. So the cerebrum is undoubtedly damaged by the disease and the pressure it endures. But when Andy was infected, he'd gotten so used to writing on the whiteboard, and even post-infection, he still wrote on the board with blood out of compulsion. And even as everyone in the mall sees, the parking lot is completely packed with people. Now, it may sound strange now with online shopping and human contact being avoided, but once upon a time, people used to actually congregate at malls. If you can believe it, like a lot. It was a place to hang out. So after infection, people would still have these drives from their pre-infection state, indicating that some portions of their cerebrum remains intact and operational. Even the little neighborhood girl who interacted with Anna a lot gets into her house because she still remembers Anna prior to her infection. So I do not believe that the virus is airborne but bodily fluid dependent. Those infected are still alive but detrimentally altered by the virus and aggressive. And this is just a virus produced by humanity, as a virus like this, apart from possibly Ebola, wouldn't affect the meat suit in such a manner. So could there actually be a measure put in place to stop this disease? Well, if a person could be sedated, it's completely possible their own body could overcome this disease by natural immune system, as they are still technically alive. And even still, anti-inflammatory medicine could be administered to keep pressure off the brain until the virus is cleared. An antiviral medication could also be administered to stop the replication of this virus as the body fights it. That said, it is extremely fast acting and quickly overwhelmed all military and health organizations, and because of this, they were not able to effectively respond to this threat. Although I will say, because of the living nature of those infected, they would eventually have to start dropping if no new food sources were found and water was not taken in, because they are not supernatural and they are still very much so human. Likely the only thing keeping them alive for the time being is the blood drank from those they take down and the meat that fills their stomach. And I also just want to note something about the dog for a moment. They may not attack it because their eyes are heavily damaged by the bursting blood vessels. The dog could be a tasty target if they could see it, but because it may be out of the infected's line of sight, it is able to move through, because as soon as the infected see that door open, they begin to attack to get Andy. So maybe a dog isn't a foolproof measure. But I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and leaving a like would be great if you did. If you just found this channel, subbing is also a good way to know on when I post. And again, posting live streams on my third channel and streaming on Twitch if that interests you. So interestingly, my state is opening back up on Friday because there has apparently been a significant drop in COVID-19 infections. So just wish us luck on that one, I guess. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, second and third channel links in the description if anyone is interested in that. And I would also like to thank my patrons. Huge shout out to our astronaut, It's Not a Spoon. Thank you for returning, my guy. And next up, our two scientists are Skilt and Trey Wendenall. And I want to thank the rest of you guys as well. Your help is greatly appreciated, because right now, let's just say the livelihood of YouTubers is in total freefall, which is expected because everything else is currently in a flux. So your help is absolutely fantastic during this time. All right, so that's gonna about do it for me. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see y'all in the next one.